In your headlines this morning, the Connecticut Department of Education says they will not follow the Trump administration's new DEI compliance order. Now the question becomes, how will the federal government respond? Your reporter Marcy Jones is live outside the Capitol building in Hartford. And Marcy, this decision could strip millions of dollars in funding from the state.
That's right. Good morning, Tracy. Well, state leaders have previously remarked that they are ready and willing to step in at any time should the State Department find themselves in the need to find more funding. Now, a letter sent from the state's Department of Education to the Trump administration says that Connecticut is already in compliance with anti-discrimination laws and principles. As far as the impact goes, if the administration decides to suspend or cut funds in response, that federal money is used to help students with disabilities and low-income families. It's also likely to impact cities like Waterbury, Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport that rely on that money more heavily. Now, Connecticut isn't the only state that is taking a stance against the federal government right now. Coming up in just about half an hour, we're going to talk about the other states that are declining to sign that compliance request currently. Your reporter in Hartford, Marcy Jones, Channel 3 Eyewitness News.
All right, Marcy, thank you. And today, the American Association of University Professors at Yale is rallying to defend higher education. Hands off higher ed is the latest in a string of nationwide protests against the Trump administration's executive orders, some which aim to strip funding from colleges and universities.